there's a sort of naive utopianism about how, sort of everyone can go to Oxford, sort of thinking, which is not humane. It's kind of narcissistic. It's the narcissism of the anywhere class.
Hello, welcome to the Ideas Sleep Furiously podcast. I'm Matt Archer. Today I'm incredibly excited to be speaking to one of my dream guests, David Goodhart. David is a British journalist, commentator and author. He's the founder and former editor of Prospect magazine. He's probably most famous for his 2017 book, The Road to Somewhere, in which he argued that a fault line existed in Britain between somewheres, those people firmly connected to a specific community, which consists of about half the population, and the anywheres, those usually living in cities, people who are socially liberal, well-educated. These people make up about 20 to 25% of the total population. But in David's opinion, they had actually overruled the attitudes of the majority. And this divide is something which is by no means unique to Britain. It's highly relevant to America, with both Brexit and Trump being a revolt led by the somewheres. In this conversation, David and I talk about his most recent book, Head, Hand, Heart, in which he argues that a good society needs a balance between aptitudes. Aptitudes like cognitive skills, manual skills, and caring skills, or head, hand, and heart. David argues that the recent decades in the West have seen far too much emphasis on rewarding cognitive ability as the gold standard of human esteem. For David, readjusting this balance is the story of the struggle for status and dignity in the 21st century. So with that contextual primer out of the way, I give you the wonderful David Goodhart. So David, I just wanted to start by saying what a privilege it is to be speaking with you. I've read The Road to Somewhere and Head, Hand, Heart twice now, and I think it was the first book which really, catapulted me out of my socially liberal echo chamber and made me appreciate how silently suffocating a university campus and a middle-class milieu can be. And that's despite the fact that I grew up very working class and was the first in my family to go to university. So first of all, thank you very much for writing that book and all your work since. The quote that I've used for the thumbnail on this video is from Head, Hand, Heart, which is, "Smart people have become too powerful." Could you unpack what that means for viewers and explain perhaps the common threads between your two books?
Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting me on, and I'm glad my books have spoken to you. Now, obviously, it's sort of slightly glib slogan. Smart people have become too powerful, but I think it does sum up. Actually, both books in some ways, and the two books, as you note, are very much related. It's like kind of volume 1 and volume 2. Clearly, smart people are useful to humanity in all sorts of ways. Being smart is a wonderful thing in many ways. Look at the pandemic. I mean, we would be struggling even more than we are without the work of highly intelligent people working in medical scientific teams, coming up with the vaccines, working across borders usually to produce these breakthroughs, and that should be celebrated, as well as the key worker point that people are always making about how most of the people we found ourselves most directly reliant on were people without university degrees, often in minimum wage jobs, stacking shelves in supermarkets and so on. I think both of these things can be true, but I think the problem, the road to somewhere, and my distinction between people who see the world from anywhere and the people who see the world from somewhere. I mean, the problem is not that the anywhere worldview is to be despised or regretted in any way. similarly with the somewhere worldview, both of these worldviews are perfectly decent and, at least in their mainstream forms, perfectly legitimate and decent. The problem is that they are in certain key respects, in conflict with each other, and that one has become, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years, one has become far too powerful, has dominated our political, economic, and cultural institutions, and has become sort of the only game in town. And I guess I dug deeper into that problem in Head, Hand, Heart, and looked at the rise, as it were, of the kind of cognitive class, which overlaps substantially with the anywhere class. And there is a certain set of values and priorities and assumptions associated with anywheres and with people who are highly educated and highly intelligent. I mean, the two things are not always the same. We know that socioeconomic advantage can obviously turn people of kind of modest intellectual ability into sort of successful professional people, and there are many highly able people who, for whatever reason, don't want to or don't get the chance to develop their intellectual skills in a sort of formal university environment. But I mean, the problem is that as I say, the values and priorities of the highly educated tend to focus on certain things, on mobility. I mean, particularly in this country with overwhelmingly residential universities, we're an international outlier in that respect, but most elite university sectors tend to be residential. The kind of mass higher education in most countries tends not to be residential. We're unusual in that even the kind of mass higher education tends to be residential here. That what we've done essentially sort of to massify the sort of classical elite higher education associated with an Oxford or a Cambridge. So mobility, openness generally. I mean, these tend to be, as psychologists will tell you, actually, highly intelligent people tend to have this bias towards openness and fluidity. They're more comfortable with social change, partly because they benefit from social change too. I mean, if you're manipulating information, you're dealing in ideas. These are things where sort of geographical boundaries tend to be seen as an obstacle. These are all perfectly decent things. Openness, mobility, or individual autonomy, particularly, is something that I mean, one of the other sort of binaries that I talked about in The Road to Somewhere was not original to me, but drawn from this American sociologist Talcott Parsons and his way of thinking about human identity on this spectrum between ascribed at one end and achieved at the other. I think it's a really helpful way of looking at things. And most highly educated people tend to have an achieved identity. They've done well at school, they've gone to more or less good universities, they've had successful professional careers, and they tend to think of themselves, not entirely wrongly, as sort of the product of their own achievements. When obviously their sort of social structure and their family background and so on will have helped them perhaps in various ways. And actually, perhaps this is particularly true maybe of people like yourself, people who've come from socioeconomic backgrounds that are not normally associated with higher education, people who often then feel rather kind of distanced from the culture of their family origins, and have a very strong sense of being the sort of product of their own achievements. And I think that creates a kind of a slightly misleading sense of the autonomy of the kind of human biography, which contributes to a very individualistic worldview. This is sometimes been described as as the weird worldview, as sort of Western educated, industrial. I would actually use the other eye to say individualistic um, 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 the worldview of educated people in rich countries, essentially, which has become the sort of norm of thinking about the world, whereas in fact, as the kind of weird acronym suggests, we are very unusual in our priorities. And I think, I think it's been quite damaging for our politics to have had these priorities so dominant, perhaps combined with a certain degree of sort of self-righteousness about them too, that there's a kind of, they don't all, there are lots of people who might be described as on the right or centre-right of politics who would also subscribe to that sort of anywhere worldview, mobility, openness, autonomy. But it's nonetheless, it tends to have a sort of somewhat progressive bias, and it is very distant from the worldview and the priorities of large minorities, if not majorities, of our fellow citizens. Most people tend to prefer the familiar to the unfamiliar. Most people prefer, security and familiarity to rapid change. And indeed, I think it's one of the sort of failings of modern liberalism, I think, has been the over-eager embrace of change, and fluidity in human relations more generally. Yeah, there is obviously that there are positive aspects of that, obviously, but I think there's been a lack of imagination on the part of the people who've tended to dominate our societies in the last generation or two, in not taking account of the interests of people who see rapid change as loss, and people who are much happier to remain relatively rooted, people whose identities are drawn very much more from the kind of ascribed end of the spectrum, meaning things about themselves that they can't really change, the groups they belong to, the places they come from. And like I've said, I think populism partly has its roots in the failure of sort of the mass elite of Western countries in recent years to recognise that as it were, legitimate reluctance to sort of embrace full-scale liberal modernity, with all that sort of dislocation and fluidity, because if your identity is primarily based on group and place, and if that place and group change because of rapid social change, after all, we had a whole working class culture in Britain disappeared in about 25, 30 years, from the kind of late 60s, early 70s, to the end of the last century. And that left a lot of people with a deep sense of loss and dislocation, I think, because their identities were drawn primarily from place and group. That change affected their sense of themselves in a way that those with more kind of self-made, achieved identities were able to surf those waves of change much more comfortably, because they drew their sense of themselves from their own individual biography, and that sort of individualism allowed them to it made their identity more sort of portable. So you can live in the edgy inner city quite comfortably, because you have a different sense of yourself. So yeah, I think that's what I mean when I say smart people have become too powerful. That the priorities of smart people have been too dominant. There's nothing wrong with smart people, and smart people are essential to human progress in many ways. But they've been too politically dominant.
This is a channel which has the tagline, interdisciplinary education is the future, which is something I strongly believe in as someone that's mainly self-taught, even at university. I want to kind of highlight what I think are the most important problems that you and people like Paul Collier in The Future of Capitalism talk about, and people like Matt Goodwin and others, in terms of education and the economy, and just try and get your response and your latest thoughts. So, in The Road to Somewhere, you mentioned that 17% of Brits leave school functionally illiterate, 22% leave functionally innumerate. Relatedly, Paul Collier writes in The Future of Capitalism that by age 6, differences in educational attainment, which will appear in a decade, are able to be predicted, meaning the first few years are more important than the 12 years at school. Then we have a different series of epidemics, which I would be fascinated to get your thoughts on, because it's not something that you really write about in The Road to Somewhere or Head, Hand, Heart. 22% of millennials say they have no friends. 27% said that they had no close friends. About 1 in 3 men aged 18 to 24 reported no sexual activity in 2019. 46% of young people aged 12 to 16 feel that they're addicted to their smartphones. For youth, major depression increased 52% from 2005 to 2017, and from 8.7%, that was from 8.7% to 13.2%, and it rose 63% in young adults aged 18 to 25 from 2009 to 2017. How much do those trends worry you? What do you think we can do about them? And I guess the overarching question here is, what would your ideal education system look like? Because presumably it would be a system which tackled a lot of these terrifying trends.
Yeah, I mean, I think the figure you quoted at the beginning that comes from something called the Sheffield Report, I think, which came out in 2012 or 2013. I mean, I don't know what the current figure is, but I think we have shied away from kind of acknowledging there's a sort of naive utopianism about how, you know, sort of everyone can go to Oxford sort of thinking, which is not humane. It's kind of narcissistic. It's the narcissism of the anywhere class, saying that, you know, oh, well, but you know, surely everybody can be like us. Well, no, not everybody can be like you. There is a huge range of human ability and a huge range of intellectual ability, and I guess, you know, the kind of 11, 12 years or whatever it is, the compulsory schooling ought to be partly about finding out what people are good at, and building on. I'm very much in favour of many of the Gove reforms of the early 2010s. I think that the kind of rigor that him and Cummings represented, and the the kind of hostility to the grade inflation, and I mean, we had invested, you know, New Labour invested a huge amount in secondary education without an enormous amount to show for it in genuinely improved standards. I think there was some progress in primary education, much more limited, I think, in secondary. And I think a lot of the reforms, the academy reforms, free schools, and so on, have a lot to be said for them. I think, you know, the basic belief that nearly everybody, not absolutely everybody, but nearly everybody can get up to really good basic level, basic academic level, kind of in English and maths and so on, if they are well taught in a rigorous and disciplined school environment. Then, you know, and we do have some of these examples, particularly in London, schools like Mossbourne and Michaela, where it has been shown that, you know, that pretty well everybody, I mean, that can get up to a certain level, and kids often from very disadvantaged backgrounds can, when very well taught, you know, walk into elite universities. I think one of the weaknesses was a lack of hand and heart in a way, in that it kind of reinforced. I mean, there was a kind of egalitarian democratic impulse, I think, behind it, but it kind of represented too much a sort of academic anywhere worldview. And schools to this day are judged far too much, I think, on the number of kids they send to elite universities. And there are other forms of intelligence, there are other forms of capability, and I think a lot of I mean, practical skills, the things that used to be taught in so-called domestic science, the things that used to be taught in sort of carpentry and metalwork, have been disappearing. I think they've now almost completely disappeared from the school curriculum. I think that is not a good thing. I think I suggest in Head, Hand, Heart, everybody should leave school having mastered at least, or having made some steps towards mastering, one practical skill, from coding to carpentry. And I think, the teaching of the arts, art, drawing, painting, dancing, acting, and music. These are vital human skills too. I think in Victorian times, the educated person was someone who could speak at least one foreign language and play a musical instrument. I mean, with that, we seem to have kind of lost that sense of the sort of rounded, sort of capable person. And I think there are lots of people, particularly people obviously brought up in homes where they, perhaps in single parent homes, without books on the shelves, without a parent, using a kind of extended vocabulary to them from an early age, who are going to, who are going to be sort of fighting this academic battle with one hand tied behind their back, and I think this is often caricatured as well. People just want to, allow, better off people to dominate the kind of academic positions and send all the working class kids into sort of carpentry, metalwork classes or whatever. I mean, that's the sort of scar that has been left by the 1944 Education Act and the sort of grammar school secondary modern divide. I mean, I think one should almost look at it the other way around. I mean, actually, we want privileged kids who, many of whom are not at all academic, but with the help of extra tutoring and so on, can most, unless they're really very dim, can be helped into Russell Group universities and into professional jobs. We'll stop it. Allow them to do something else. If they're not intellectually able, they quite possibly have other capabilities that can also be monetized, or entrepreneurial abilities or whatever. I mean, often the fish rots from the head, but the fish is also inspired by what's going on in the head, as it were. I think it'd be great to see, as it were, fewer privileged kids going to university and more of them, becoming artisanal cheesemakers in Hackney or whatever it is. And I think we are going to see that. I mean, I think we're beginning to see that more generally, that people have become disillusioned with the single ladder to the idea of a successful life necessarily running up through higher education. It's a much narrower and sort of less imaginative route than used to be the case 50 or 100 years ago. There were lots of little ladders up. We need to, we just need to cultivate a wider range of capability. I mean, I do feel sorry for schools. So much is loaded upon them, and actually, as you were saying earlier, I mean, so much is actually determined in the family even before you go to school. I mean, in terms of the kind of rise in depression and anxiety, and I mean, I'm a little bit skeptical about some of the stats here. I mean, when it comes to depression, there is some relatively hard medical evidence that there isn't the crisis that I mean, many of these surveys are kind of have a huge selection bias in them, but I mean what is it? Simon Westley, he's like sort of chief psychiatrist, says that much of this is not true. The mental health of young people, with one group, he does say there is quite hard evidence for their sort of declining mental health, and that is, I think, young women aged sort of 14 to 20 or something like that.
Yeah,
and
the Snapchat generation.
Yeah, and I think so. Social media probably can and should take quite a lot of the blame for that. I mean, the way that it kind of makes it so much easier to compare ourselves with others and to feel left out, and but I think, yeah, we should be careful about not exaggerating the problem there.
Because I'm wary of time, I want to try and move us on rather artificially to issues of the economy. Did you read the now unfortunately late David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs?
I did. I actually reviewed it in the Sunday Times quite critically.
Oh, really?
I mean, not because the underlying idea. Well, I didn't think the underlying idea was particularly original, I have to say, and it was a classic example of something that should have remained as a magazine article, which is how it started life, and he just sort of padded it out and produced it. I mean, I know it's been very successful. I think that's probably partly mainly because of the title. I wonder how many people have actually read it. And I was also kind of select. I think. I mean, I know this is slightly sacrilegious. Lots of people swear by him, but I thought he had a sort of slightly puerile, kind of anarcho-leftist worldview. But I mean, yeah, I mean, it's an important theme. I mean, having meaning, having a sense that you're contributing in what you do, I think is important. And I think one of the reasons for the rise in the number of people who feel they are in bullshit jobs is because of the sort of academicization of our whole society. And aspects of that are obviously beneficial. I mean, the fact that far fewer of us are having to slave away in the fields, planting potatoes, or far fewer are doing repetitive manual jobs in factories, is a great step forward. But I mean that the human division of labour is both a wonderful thing from the point of view of productivity, but a pretty deadly thing from the point of view of the quality of many jobs. And there's a sort of necessary tension there. And I think that there are always going to be quite a few jobs that will be sort of inherently dull or repetitive, or but they're probably going to decline in number. I think they've been on. They were. I mean, I think Graeber's books are probably caught a sort of peak bullshit, as it were. And I do think this is also related to the kind of the something I talk about in Head, Hand, Heart, which is sort of we've reached peak head, that in the sense that more and more people have been coming out of university with academic qualifications, expecting that to lead to a high status, well-paid professional job, and in many cases, increasing number of cases now, it isn't leading in that direction at all. It's leading to, and that's creating a great disappointment, which I think Graeber's book sort of taps into. The disappointment of and many people like you, first in your family to go to university. Mind you, given how rapidly university education has been expanding, that applies to almost everybody going to university. and I think you end up on a sort of 22 grand a year kind of back office job when you're expecting to be, I don't know, an academic or a country doctor or sort of something, wearing a sort of tweed suit and people deferring to your authority on something. That ain't happening. But a lot of those bullshit jobs are going to be swept away by AI. So I think we're going to be in a sort of post-Graeber world. But I think the contribution element is also one of the kind of things that's been driving populism, and that sense that it's somehow only academic things, only jobs that are involved in the manipulation of information that somehow have value, and that so much else that is done is less valued. And I think a lot of people have felt all those sort of people in London and the big metropolitan centres who seem to earn the high incomes, and they seem to kind of all the importance seems to attach to them. And I guess one feels that particularly in sort of post-industrial areas of the country where the contribution of the South Yorkshire coalfield to the powering of Britain was just self-evident. If you came from that area, you knew your relatives, your area was making this great contribution to the country. And somehow over the recent decades, because of the emphasis on the kind of academic and the kind of abstract and the manipulation of information, it's all those sort of grander office jobs and the financial manipulation and but have been receiving the reward and the esteem. And I think that that's led to a sense on the part of many people, like I say, particularly in post-industrial areas, that they're no longer contributing. And that's why I think it's important to sort of shift the emphasis back to basic jobs, manual jobs, caring jobs in particular. And these actually are going to be the kind of growth areas. The jobs that cannot be replaced by artificial intelligence or robots, or and some of these are very driving jobs. Being an HGV driver, we have a crisis of HGV drivers at the moment, because people have been led to believe these are somehow not contributing or not contributing in the way that gathers esteem. But so those jobs are going to be absolutely vital still. I mean, the final delivery, the Amazon delivery person, and of course the care jobs that we still we have huge problems filling the care jobs, whether it's nursing jobs in the NHS or working in care homes. And we are going to have, we don't really have any choice. We're going to have to pay them better and give them more esteem. Having said that, I mean, I think a lot of nurses tend to have quite high esteem, and actually they're not badly paid either.
Yeah,
I mean, it's quite a flat pay hierarchy, but so it's quite difficult for hospitals to attract nurses back once they've qualified, but have perhaps gone off and had families. And given the amount of responsibility and stress involved in a nursing job, the kind of pay for a sort of 45-year-old returnee nurse is simply not good enough. So they're not returning in the numbers that are necessary.
I just want to push you slightly on your anarchism comment, because I feel like a lot of the issues that you point to in both books, now whilst it's not a panacea, it seems like a lot of those problems could be somewhat alleviated via an injection of workplace democracy, the alienation and the meaning. I think that's what people like Graeber and people like Noam Chomsky point to. I realise that they're mainly diagnostic books, but is that something that you would be in favour of?
Well, I think we already have it. I think this is kind of there's a sort of straw man here.
Right.
We don't have it everywhere, but there will always be an irreducible number of basic jobs that don't have inherent satisfaction. I mean, it's true, there are lots of the kind of jobs that you and I do, being a medical consultant or an actor or a writer or many professional jobs do have a kind of intrinsic satisfaction to them. And there are many other kinds of jobs that never will. Being an Amazon delivery person is never going to be intrinsically satisfactory. Well, but if your working conditions are decent, if you have you're working in a friendly working environment, you're treated with respect, you have promotion possibilities. Even the most basic, supermarkets are, massive employers of people. We probably employ more people in supermarkets than we do in all the manufacturing industries put together. And a lot of those jobs are quite basic, working on a till, stacking shelves. But there's a hierarchy, like in almost any sector. And you can climb it, and you can become a kind of head of a section. You can then become a sort of, junior manager, and you can end up, managing a supermarket that employs 800 people, and might well be one of the biggest employers in your town. Like I say, not everybody wants promotion, though. Many people want to, work part time, earn a decent amount of money, and as long as the working environment is friendly and you get on with your fellow workers, a lot of people actually like going to work for those reasons. It's one of the reasons I'm against UBI, is that I think people draw a lot of meaning from work. It gives their lives structure and meaning, as well as income, obviously. I think UBI is a sort of tech oligarch fantasy. It's another example of where highly educated anywhere type people think that everybody in the world is like them. Highly driven and outwardly directed, and actually most people aren't highly driven. They don't, and many people kind of need structure around them to function well. And if you're just handing people a check so they can sit at home and play video games, I think then sort of depression and death via alcoholism would absolutely go through the roof. So I'm not in favour of that, but I think almost all jobs can be decent. People can want to go to them when they wake up in the morning. Like I say, obviously they have to, just the basics have to be right, and in many cases they are right. And if they're not, then people need to, complain, and there are usually mechanisms of redress. One of the biggest ones being that we have a relatively free labour market. You can go and find a similar job down the road. Particularly at the moment, we're in a position of a very, very tight labour market, which is great. Wages are rising, and I think this is a longer term trend too. We've been through the period where, particularly as it were, people in lower socioeconomic groups in rich countries have been the ones squeezed by the kind of the one-off expansion to the global labour market in the last 30 or 40 years, with the arrival of China and India onto the global labour market. That drove down the cost of labour in rich countries for people doing for working in kind of industry, factory type jobs. But that's kind of happened, and it's sort of worked its way through the system. And actually, the global labour market is going to be tighter and tighter, I think, in coming decade. So the kind of power balance is going to shift back. Now, I suspect that won't involve the return of trade unions on a big scale. They were a function of large working units. And probably the largest working unit in most of our towns and cities is going to either be an NHS hospital or a supermarket. In terms of sort of actual physical production, there isn't going to be a return to the kind of 19th century factory system, even if we do kind of re-industrialize to some extent. So I don't expect to see a big rise in unions, but I think the individual worker will have more power, already does have more power in many circumstances at the moment, and will express that power through leaving unless they get a pay rise, or unless their supervisor stops, being so demanding or whatever.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of relatively optimistic about work in a way. Like I say, AI is going to take away a lot of the sort of middle class drudgery jobs that I think Graeber was mainly talking about. So yeah.
I want to get on to audience questions, but my final question is, what's the best critique that you've received of both books? I know David Willits wrote I think a somewhat unfair review, but in your opinion?
One thing that, Head, Hand, Heart, one thing that slightly irritated me, but made me think I should have emphasized it even more, is that, obviously it's an artificial distinction, Head, Hand, Heart. I was rather irritated by Madeline Bunting's stress on this, but obviously everything we do is a combination of the kind of cognitive and the emotional and the embodied. And obviously all jobs require a combination of those things too, but it's also the case that you can have, that there are some jobs that emphasize the cognitive more than the kind of physical or the emotional. So, and like I said, I did point out, I did admit that it was a kind of artificial distinction in 3 or 4 times in the book. I should probably have done it 8 or 10 times. So I've been slightly disappointed in a way. Yeah, there's a sort of Willits critique, which and a lot of people in higher education were very defensive about both books in a way. And they're sort of kicking away the lad. A lot of ad hominem sort of kicking away the lad. It's all right for you. You went to Russell Root University. Your kids have done. You want to stop all these working class kids going to university and make them do metalworking. Oh, for fuck's sake! That is not what I want. I think people who are highly intellectually able from any class should. We have great universities, great research universities. They're an important part of our economy, our culture, but you don't get a more productive research base in your country, in your economy, by just sending willy-nilly more and more people to university. This is a complete myth. The number of people that are capable of producing new knowledge, whether in science or technology or indeed the humanities, is tiny and always will be tiny. There's
probably correlates with the second standard deviation, right, of the IQ bell curve, right? So that's what 15% of people, probably fewer.
Yeah, no, far fewer than 50% of the population produce new knowledge, useful.
Oh,
new
yeah,
knowledge.
in terms of novelty, it's probably 2%.
Yeah, or even less. And it doesn't rise the more people you send to university. You just create a sort of bigger sort of cognitive bureaucracy. Again, I guess this is sort of partly what Graeber was complaining about. So I do agree with them about that. But and it's also premised on the lack of value that we attribute to other human capabilities, to other human abilities, relating to technical and practical intelligence, and care and emotional intelligence, and and all these other things that have been undervalued. And it's a kind of it's this sort of academic monoculture. Now, David Willits was higher education minister. He's written a huge book on higher education. It's he has a vested interest. Even more so do the kind of academics who defend the current status quo. But I think it's pretty indefensible, really, if you look at it objectively. It's done nothing for social mobility. Quite the opposite. Many of the accounts of the decline or the sort of plateauing off of social mobility attributed precisely to the expansion of higher education, which has been so monopolized by the middle and upper middle classes. And the fact that a proportion of working class kids go to university too is not a reason for for continuing to expand higher education when we have this horrendous missing middle of technical skills and so on, and these jobs are now being extremely well paid because there are so few people out there doing them. So we have the missing middle problem to worry about, and of course, as I already said, the kind of the care crisis of recruitment in the various public care industries. No, I mean, you can understand why so many people are going to universities still. I mean, the thing is on automatic pilot. The universities have a massive, they're businesses as well as cultural institutions, and they get however many thousands of pounds it is for every kid they recruit. So that they are not objective, obviously, in this argument. I mean, one of the other problems is that employers have used a university degree as a sort of screening process, and something like 35–40% of all the jobs in the British economy are now graduate only, in effect, which I think is, I think graduate only jobs should be banned. I mean, obviously there are lots of jobs that require high levels of cognitive skill, and many of those jobs will be a combination of hand or head and heart often. I mean, the kind of job of the future I often refer to is that the dimensioner, sort of classic combination of requiring the a lot of book learned knowledge to understand what we do know about this terrible illness, but it also requires to be a really good dimensioner. Requires the patience of Job. You need to be like a sort of a brilliant parent with a difficult child, and I think a lot of those sorts of combinations will become more important in the labour market as we go forward.
So I want to try and get at least 2 audience questions in before 3 quickfire questions. So if you can be concise, I know that they will be very grateful. The first one comes from Rory, and his question, he's got 4, but I'm just picking the best one. Can anybody turn the Labour Party around? If not, what do you think could replace it? And what are your thoughts on the Blue Labour movement going forward? I personally think Paul Embry should become Labour leader, but there we go.
I think, how can the Labour Party break out of its sort of liberal graduate ghetto, both in terms of personnel and in terms of its sort of policy bias? I think it's very difficult, and I think it probably will break up or continue its decline. I mean, there is what's the guy who's mayor of Bristol, I think is perhaps one to watch.
I forget his name, but I know the one. Yeah, Marvin Rees.
Marvin Rees, that's right. Yeah. About 8 or 9 years ago, I went to a fundraising dinner for him, and I bid for and won a boxing training session in Bristol. It's absolutely shattering. I think he's sort of come out of the kind of Bristol Colston business quite well from what I've heard of him.
All right, I'm going on to Betfair after this. I'm putting £1,000
on. But I think I think the only policy that the Labour Party can have at the moment is essentially to hold the Tory party to account over levelling up. I mean, to say, and say at the next election, you promised to level up Britain and you haven't. No, I mean, obviously they're not going to have levelled up very much in the next 3 or 4 years, given how deep and structural many of the problems related to our grotesque regional inequality are. But it is quite likely that they will not be able to show very much progress. I'd be very surprised if they return to being, a kind of electable government soon. And I think they probably need to. I mean, it depends on whether we adopt PR. I mean, I assume the Labour Party is in favour of it because it's the only way. It's only really a way back to power. Perhaps with the SNP if Scotland doesn't become independent, and then I don't but there are still lots of kind of Blairites that Andrew Adonis is still in the Labour Party. There's still a lot of Corbynistas. I mean, there are. All parties obviously have a big spectrum. But I mean, I think the problem, the sentence or couple of sentences is often used to kind of express the current political moment is that it's easier for the right to move to the left on economics than it is for the left to move right on culture. And as culture has become so much central to politics, that puts Labour at an enormous disadvantage, I think. Now people sort of say, well, actually, Labour has some strong cards too in the culture wars. They point, I think, probably wrongly to the kind of, the end of the Euros and the kind of taking the knee and so on as somehow a victory for kind of the left in the culture wars. I'm not actually sure it really was, but you can sometimes see that point. But I think overall that observation holds water. I guess if it continues to decline, there will the kind of the grandees of the centre left will probably split off. I mean, they could always join the Lib Dems, which is essentially kind of centre left party. I think there will be a place for a kind of leftish liberal party, partly reflecting the interests of this now huge population of liberalish graduates, perhaps particularly in London and the southeast, often sort of sucked down from the north and the Midlands. But I think this sort of class reversal, as we've seen in America, the Republican Party is a working class party now. The Tory Party is now more of a working class party in terms of voters than the Labour Party. Again, partly for cultural reasons, and I can't really see that reversing. And of course, the Tory Party has its own problem of how do you represent your new, more sort of precarious electorate, very public services dependent, poorer electorate in the Midlands and the North. How do you align their interests with the southern middle class and richer Britons? I mean, well, perhaps you don't actually. I mean, you're going to have to take some decisions at some point. Anyway.
The final audience question is from Ines. You've had 4 children with a woman that seems to have had an equally busy professional life to yourself. How did you juggle the responsibilities of fatherhood with the successful pursuit of your interests and such an interesting and successful career? I'm very curious as to the day-to-day logistics of such people.
Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't do it that successfully, and indeed, you should buy and read my wife's book, Re-Educated, which has just come out, which has a few revelations about family life. I mean, I suppose I had the advantage of being well off. So when children were young, Lucy was working part-time. She worked 3 days a week, and we had a nanny on the other days of the week when children were young. I worked from home quite a lot when I was editing Prospect magazine for much of the period when the children were very young. So I could play a reasonably significant role in their childhoods. kind of, looking back on it now, I guess I sort of think I should have been doing more. I mean, if you look at it over generations, which is obviously a helpful way of looking at it from my point of view. I mean, I did infinitely more. I was infinitely more involved in my children's lives than my father was involved in my or my siblings' lives. I mean, Lucy did more of the kind of domestic labour and the doing homework with the kids and so on than I did. And that sort of created some of the usual resentments and conflicts, but I don't think to a particularly high degree. Yeah, I mean, but both of us, both me and Lucy, were very lucky in a way. I mean, we did both have very demanding jobs, but we had a lot of help too. Lucy's parents lived nearby when the children were very young, and they were very close to them. Yeah, I mean, it is one of the kind of unfortunate facts of life is that if you are quite ambitious and you have sort of professional ambitions, they often coincide with the period of highest demand from family as well, and I think I think one of the things that's come out of the pandemic actually is a sort of return, the kind of return of domesticity almost. Now, obviously, it's not always been a very happy story. You read the headlines about increases in domestic abuse and so on, but I think a lot of the survey evidence shows that people have been rather surprisingly sort of glad almost to rediscover family life. I suppose we're talking about more kind of upper middle class people doing professional jobs. I mean, I think a lot of public policy has been rather biased against the family and against domesticity, and it's all been about how both parents can spend as little time as possible in the family, and what it is to achieve is seen as almost entirely a kind of public realm thing. And when it comes to kind of relations between men and women, it's only the public realm that we look at. We never look at the private realm. I mean, my experience, certainly my own personal experience, and those of most people I know, women tend to dominate the private realm when children are young. They tend to be more involved in their lives, but we kind of don't regard that as a sort of as part of the equation, which I think we should. I mean, I think we should sort of pull the camera back and look at the private realm and the public realm. And I think this will be one of the themes of the next few years. Indeed, it's what I think I want to write my next book about is. I think it's the sort of third great failing of modern liberalism in some ways. I mean, the first is, I mentioned earlier, the over-enthusiastic embrace of rapid change, forgetting that actually it's very discomforting to most people. There's a kind of right-wing version of that, is the creative destruction of modern capitalism and being too careless about deindustrialization. It happened far too rapidly in this country, even if you compare it to somewhere like Germany. The left-wing version is being careless about immigration, not thinking that it changes anything. I mean, I think the second big failing is the kind of head, hand, heart one, that we placed far too much emphasis on just one form of human ability. I think the third one is the third failing of modern liberalism is to kind of ignore the importance of domesticity in family life to most people, and actually to make it easier through public policy to sort of strengthen the family and to help people get through some of those very stressful periods when they're at their most intense, both at work and in family life, where a lot of couples break up at that stage because of that pressure. And actually, make it easier for one parent, probably usually the woman, but not always the woman, to stay at home when children are very young. I mean, polling evidence suggests that would be very, very popular, and yet it's something that that Westminster completely ignores. So yeah.
David, you have to run to central London, but before you do, can I just ask you 3 quick questions? 1, what is your favourite book of all time?
Oh, blimey.
Fiction or non-fiction, doesn't matter.
I think the fiction book that kind of turned me on to modern fiction, and particularly sort of magical realism, was The Passion by Jeanette Winterson. My favourite non-fiction book, which was very influential on me in The Road to Somewhere, is the Jonathan Haidt book, The Righteous Mind.
Fantastic. Yes, that's very well thumbed. I've got a million annotations in Haidt's book. Who is one of your role models?
Oof, one of my role models, blimey. It's a good question. Ask me the third, and I'll try and come back to this.
Okay. If you couldn't have chosen your current career, what would you have picked instead with the benefit of hindsight?
I think I would have liked to have been a musician of some kind. I mean, I'm not a trained musician anyway at all. I've made various half-hearted attempts to learn the piano, but I wish I had been forced to when I was young. Yeah, I think being a jazz pianist is a sort of fantasy of mine. And a kind of role model.
Surely a jazz pianist.
Well, yeah, perhaps a jazz pianist yeah. So, and perhaps someone who sort of straddles one or two different. I mean, I like the sort of the generalist. I like the. I mean, obviously, not everybody can be good at everything, but or perhaps someone who's really good at sport and also writing. How about Michael Atherton? Let me choose Michael Atherton as my role model.
We'll get him on Twitter. This will be the clip that we use.
I also actually met him, and he said he'd read The Road to Somewhere and liked it. So,
oh, fantastic. Well, one thing I wanted to say to you was that Rory wanted to say that he's in public affairs and political consultancy, and he says that book is basically mandatory reading for all consultants. So he wanted to know if you knew that. But
no, I didn't.
David, thank you so much for your time.
Sorry to be a bit briefer than I might have been, and I hope you can edit out the blips.
I will do, yeah.
The pings, rather.
Indeed, okay. Indeed. Thank you so much. Speak soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching or listening to Ideas Sleep Furiously. If you really enjoyed this podcast, then please do consider supporting the show over on Patreon for just $1 or £1. For that, you get your name in the credits, early access, and lots more goodies. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next one.